Hello and welcome to another weekly recap. Now this is interesting because I didn't do any interviews last week. I've had the week off. So I'm pointing you in the direction of some fantastic interviews that I'm sorry I missed. As ever, I suggest that you go back to look at all of the videos instead of the little clips I'm going to point at you here. And of course, I'm Philip Ingram. I present Times Radio Frontline, but I also commentate on all matters geopolitical, defence, security, counterterrorism, cyber, and anything else that people ask me to. So a couple of things just to tease you into what's happened over the past week. The first one is a clip from Donald Trump, who speaks about how he will sort of supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine to use on Russia. Let's have a look at this now.
Sell them to NATO and let them sell them to Ukraine.
Yeah, I've sort of made a decision, pretty much. If you consider, I think I want to find out what they're doing with them.
Yes.
Where are they sending them? I guess I'd have to ask that question. That war should never have started. Would have never started. Such bad judgment was used there. I think on both sides, by the way. But nobody looks good with the war with Russia and Ukraine. Nobody. That's been a horrible. This week they lost over 7,000 soldiers between the two of them. This is every week they're losing 7,000, 8,000, 5,000.
Now, the use of Tomahawk cruise missiles is critical. It sends a political message to the Russians of increasing US support to Ukraine. That will have a psychological impact. At the political level and at the higher military levels inside Russia, they'll get concerned that a larger number of their targets can be more accurately hit, because the Tomahawk cruise missile, whilst it's got a smaller warhead than the Ukrainian Flamingo, it is an awful lot more stealthy and can get through a lot of Russian air defense capability and hit more hardened targets. And it's got a variety of warheads that can have a good effect. To give you an example of the accuracy, as I've just said in the Q&A video, you can decide what window in a building you fly it through. They are that good. So that's the political effect that would have. It'll have a military effect as well, in that it'll allow Ukraine to take out these more hardened targets. The next clip I want you to have a quick look at is President Zelensky speaking on Russia. And its shadow fleet, using its shadow fleet tankers to finance the war, but also to conduct sabotage and destabilizing operations across Europe.
Детально очільник зовнішньої розвідки доповів по тому, як росіяни використовують танкери свого тіньового флоту, і не лише для фінансування війни, але й для диверсій та різної дестабілізації в Європі. Нещодавні випадки запуску дронів з танкерів – це один з таких прикладів. Наявну у нас інформацію ми передаємо партнерам, і важливо, щоб були відчутні кроки партнерів у відповідь Росії. На всіх рівнях заради цього ми працюємо. І будуть ще зустрічі, будуть перемовини з нашими партнерами, публічні і непублічні. Переконуємо, що треба не економити на рішучості. Росіяни повинні знати, що жодну їхню деструктивну активність, все підле, що вони роблять, світ без відповіді не залишить.
Now, President Zelensky is just right. The Russians have been carrying out grey zone warfare against Europe and against other countries, helping to survey and damage undersea cables. Launch drones against Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and other European countries, and generally cause disruption that is forcing the European capitals to use some of their political time, their political capital, to try and deal with it, and to test the security forces, to test their military, but to test the civil defense capability as well. This is all good intelligence gathering for the Russians. So it's something we need to be increasingly concerned about and need to watch very closely indeed. But it's below this threshold that would stimulate an automatic military response. So 3 interviews this week that I want to point you at. The first one is the Times' Maxim Tucker, and he is speaking here.
So the Russians are still encircled in those places. There's one big bottleneck that they're trying to break out of. And there's very, very heavy fighting in 2 villages around that bottleneck as the Russians kind of try and push to break there are some forces out. There are two areas of those three encirclements that are still very much cut off, and I think there's not much hope that the Russians can break those guys out, but they're trying very hard to keep a logistics line open to one of the larger groupings that was approaching Dobrapilya. The fighting there is still very, very intense, and now we're seeing more problems for the Ukrainians to the north of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, where the Russians are trying to bypass Liman and get access to that key logistic roads from Izium into Kramatorsk, which has been the basis, the headquarters of Ukrainian forces since 2014 in the Donbas.
And two of your dispatches that you've written since we last spoke have focused in very, very clearly and very precisely on parts of the operation to try and stop those Russian forces and encircle them in the Pokrovsk, near Pokrovsk. One of them in particular about someone from Dobrapilya or near Dobrapilya who had a remarkable kind of task to stop Russians getting across bridges. Can you tell us a bit more about him and what he was tasked to do?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating story, really, of how even in a drone war, one rifleman can still play a really important part in a battle like that. This was a young guy called Rus. He's in his 20s. He is an experienced soldier. He's a part of an elite reconnaissance company that's often sent in to shore up regular infantry who might be a bit more nervous about holding trench lines. And he was sent in with another reconnaissance company soldier, artist, and 4 infantrymen to basically hold 2 footbridges in an important village and stop the Russians advancing over those footbridges. And they ended up, they were told they were going there for 2 weeks. You know, it's very far that you have to walk into these positions now because of the drones. So he was walking for a full day, laden with as many supplies as they could carry to get into that position in one of the cottages in the villages and hide there. And then they were waiting for the Russians. And on the 4th day, when they set up ambush positions, the Russians eventually came. They didn't realize they were walking into an ambush. They said that the soldiers were walking with their walkie-talkies on loudly, that officers were clearly giving them directions from drones where the Russians should go. And that gave them time to set up an ambush point near the footbridge, which they knew the Russians would have to use, and get in behind them. And their own commanders were watching from above, seeing how this Russian was approaching their position, telling them to wait, not to engage them, because they wanted to be sure that when they fired, they hit them. And they got 30 meters away, and then the Ukrainians, Rusa, opened fire on this advancing Russians, ambushed them, hit them, and then these guys were finished off. Either some of them blew themselves up when they were wounded with grenades, some of them were hit by Ukrainian drones in the process. And the battle became very intense from then on. The Russians tried to push through these footbridges 8 times, and the Rus and his colleagues had to maneuver around and get behind them to set up ambush points around these bushes and attack them. And every time they did it, they managed to do so successfully and managed to do it and get away before the Russians realized where they were and get into their hiding places. And in the end, expecting to be there for 2 weeks, this young guy, Rus, was there for 50 days.
And in this clip, Maxim is speaking of the experience of tactically significant victories for Ukrainian forces in the Donbas. They managed to cut the Russians off who had advanced and extended their lines a little bit too much, and are systematically picking them off, causing huge casualties. Now, on the front line over the past few days, the Ukrainians have been having some success, and Zelensky's been emphasizing that. But I think he's emphasizing it because there's also been some Russian success as well. And from what I understand, the casualties on each side have been significant. We're talking of probably a total of 7,000 casualties between both sides in the past week alone. So we're getting, once again, in the east, the Russians overextending themselves if they manage to break through, the Ukrainians stopping that breakthrough, pushing them back and cutting them off. But in certain areas, and again to the south of Pokrovsk, there are suggestions that the Russians have advanced another few hundred meters. The Ukrainians will push them back again. This has been going on for well over a year now. And therefore, it highlights how the tactical battle really is almost a stalemate at the moment. I've got a gut feeling, and let's see if this happens over the next few weeks, that the Ukrainians are building up to something slightly bigger. The Russians are tired, too tired. So let's see what happens. But I highly recommend you watch not just this clip from Maxim, but go and watch the whole interview. Next interview is with an old friend and colleague, Robert Fox from the Evening Standard. And Robert is speaking about US support for long-range missile strikes.
What's so clever with the Ukrainians, with their limited resources, they're also doing quite shallow strikes. They're doing Belgorod. They're doing just over the border. They took out the electricity supply. They had a brownout for hours there, and they love doing that. And they're hitting the water supplies in Ukraine and the Donbas, hitting that very, very local. But it's the changing of the algebra of the standard ground battle. It was changed absolutely radically. I think I've mentioned it before, but we've got to understand the close battle is still real, and you have to have people physically taking and holding ground. This is a thing, to their shock, that the Russians and the Israelis are learning in Gaza. You cannot do it by just smashing everything to bits and then say, oh, it's all gone. This is why a war of occupation for Russia is looking as impossible as it was looking by April 2022. So you're right, because what what they're saying is, yeah, go ahead. And the Ukrainians have taken the lesson. We've been here with Taurus. We've been here with the limited use of HIMARS. Oh, you can only use it in a certain context. And what they're really saying is, actually, we'll build our own. And they're assisted by some very important principal players, surprisingly, like the Danes, helping them in rocketry and drones and so on. And it's good on you. Get on and do it. And there's another there are several aspects of it, because people are talking about knocking out energy supplies. They're not talking about what's happening to food and what's happening to the harvest. And maybe that they have harbored enough diesel reserves for the army. They haven't got enough for the combine harvesters, perhaps, it looks now. And the harvest is well done, it seems, both in Russia and in Ukraine. This is a factor. If people are going to get worried about food, and there are concerned about food as much as there is retail gasoline for cars, for domestic transport in Russia, that's a very big thing. I just want to add another factor, because it's very, very difficult to assess. And for obvious reasons, they lie about it and deceive, and that is asymmetric guerrilla activity within Russia by special ops, but above all by Artash. Artash is an insurrectionary army of Ukrainian-orientated, probably Ukrainian Russians, citizens. We have no idea really how powerful they are, but they do have some kind of reach, because it's the only way you can explain that you can maintain a rhythm of attack at deep distance. I mean, they're getting into towards Siberia. They're getting thousands of kilometers across. And it means that the area around, particularly the industrial zone upriver from the Caspian Sea, Tatarstan, where the drone factories are and so on, these are vulnerable. And I think also it must be guerrilla activity that is really very successful in putting Crimea into play. Crimea isn't secure. That is absolutely clear from all the evidence that's appearing. And while Russia indeed has the superiority in numbers and in certain kinds of technology, really ramping up, radicalizing its tactical drone campaign, the Ukrainian scheme of maneuver of now you see me, now you know, duck and dive and dodge, the transparent battlefield. I mean, they should have taken, by the boast of Gerasimov and the others, they should have taken the north pocket of Donetsk months ago, if not years ago. Why are they not doing? They still don't have Pokrovsk, Dobropila, absolutely secure, and they're keeping the battle going. And for Putin, the thing that's very difficult, they're still in tiny, tiny slivers of Russian territory itself.
And in this, he's talking about how long-range missile strikes are affecting water, electricity, energy, oil. But he's also talking about not just the strikes into Russia, but into the disputed Donbas region, having a military impact on Russia's ability to support its own troops using infrastructure in the disputed Donbas region, and showing those residents of the Donbas that are still there, that the Russians can't protect themselves. And again, Robert very eloquently explains how it's these different layers of attacks that are having the wider impact. And it seems that Ukraine is managing to carry out these attacks at times and places of its own choosing. Russia's having an increasingly difficult time in trying to defend against them. These are, of course, what would be described as the deep battle or operational level attacks, and rather than the tactical stuff that we're seeing on the front line, where the short-range drones are having devastating effects for both sides. And the final interview I want to point you out this week is former UK Defence Attaché to Moscow and Kiev, John Foreman.
Russia has experienced a strategic catastrophe by invading Ukraine. 3 years in, its entire year's advance has been tiny, and it seems to be winding down now and resetting for 2026. Russia, I think Putin's overall political intent remains the same, to bring Ukraine to heel, and we have the chances of peace have become more remote. So I do see, the ramping up of these threats, whether it's cyber, whether it's espionage, whether it's sabotage, whether it's incursions, whether it's at sea or not. The evidence is out. Is part of that to ultimately to stop us supporting Ukraine. Ukraine needs money. Ukraine does not have enough money on its own to survive. So that, I think, it's about 50 billion a year short. It's going to come from somewhere. So if you weaken political support for Ukraine, Ukraine will lose. The same with arms. Ukraine is making 50-60% of its own arms. About 30% come from Europe, and about 10% of the exquisite stuff comes from America. If that doesn't come through, the 40%, Ukraine loses. So, this is existential stuff for Ukraine. The more that Russia can do to stop the European Union, NATO, and other countries supporting Ukraine, it will carry on doing it. And I think that's why it's trying to get at the public who demand and say, why is Russia doing this to us? If only we were nice to Russia, if only we sort of settled, then all these problems will go away. I think it's the same approach, the same tactic has been throughout the whole Cold War, to be honest, and beyond.
How much of it is also perhaps as a result of the meeting in Alaska, which I think you told me even the Russians think was a disaster?
Well, I think I would call it a disaster. Well, not a disaster. I'd just call it a complete waste of time and effort. Trump trying to Hail Mary a peace deal without any preparation at the last minute was never going to work. That's not the Russian approach. I think the Russian wording now is it's a waste of time, didn't lead anywhere. So we had this sort of enthusiasm that Trump would be able to bring pressure onto Russia, or apply new sanctions or supply new arms to Ukraine, meet with Putin, but he consistently along the line he's abandoned his positions, leaving peace as remote. So I think if that peace track, shall we say, however weak, is now not on the table, then we're back to where we were before, keeping Ukraine fighting, keeping the alliance together, and imposing costs on Russia. And Russia is trying to win the war, divide the West, and isolate Ukraine. And that's honest where we've been for the last 3 years.
Now, John is speaking on the failed Russian incursion into Ukraine, and he's talking about the 3-year failed Russian incursion into Ukraine, and the failed Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. And it shows that when Trump sat down with Putin, he didn't get this path to an end to the conflict that Trump had thought he would get. In fact, my reading of the body language of the meetings is that Putin came out on top. And I think Donald Trump has realized that, and that's what's irked him completely. I don't think we're any closer to an end to this conflict. Russia has lost strategically already. It's lost its initial objectives, which were the toppling of the Zelensky government, a Ukrainian government that effectively was more Moscow aligned, and Ukraine becoming a puppet state, a bit like Belarus, and no NATO expansion. Well, NATO's grown by 2 countries. Putin was pushed back to a secondary objective in the east. He's lost his primary objective. So, from a strategic perspective, he has lost what he set out to achieve in the war. He's now scrambling to do something. Whether he can achieve that or not, certainly not in the tactical battlefield. And if US throws more support to Ukraine, Putin's in real trouble. He's got about another 12 to 18 months before that trouble will manifest itself into a threat to Putin. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So that's all from this week's recap. Please sign up for Times Radio membership. And of course, you can get us on your favourite podcast channel now by just searching for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.